Hello and welcome to the docket. I'm your host Bob Mata, and sorry for the delay, kids. You know, we're both a couple of old guys. We do the best we can. It was
I'm
definitely,
older. I'm
yeah.
older.
I wasn't going to put this one on blast like the last time we had technical difficulties because that was enough. I think for people to enjoy for a lifetime. Welcome, my friend, Mr. Bill Dorsch. It's the middle of the night or very early in the morning for you. It's good to see you again, my friend. How are you?
Yeah, we're good. It's 2:18 in the morning. So
Oof, that's rough.
yeah, it's
That is
rough. We
rough.
we changed the time, but no, we haven't changed the time yet. You guys did. So instead of 8 hours, you're 7 hours difference right now.
Yes. Yeah, it's a very reasonable hour for me, Bill, whereas it's extremely, extremely early in the morning. Now, did you go to sleep and then set an alarm to wake up?
I did try to sleep, but I didn't.
All right.
So,
So what we call that, Bill, is we call that playing through. All right.
yeah,
So
yeah.
you're
Well,
playing through. You're a champion, man. You're a champion. All right, so let's not waste any more time. Let's kind of get into it. On our last live, our last two lives were fascinating because we were introduced to a couple of ladies that had really a mind blowing story, which was I call it a near death experience with
yeah,
Gacy because they were 1 degree of separation from being in that guy's house, and they
right.
were literally in conversation and more in terms of being in his presence with somebody that we firmly believe was very much potentially a Gacy accomplice, which was
Right.
Mike Rossi. So those two gals, I thought that those were amazing interviews, and of course, that was all due to your incredible hard work and your investigative talents. Just digging folks up as you've been plowing through the Gacy nightmare for 2 decades. So, what do you have on the docket for us tonight, Mr. Dorsch?
Well, I wanted to go over the victims and survivors, several of them. I mean, there's so many people here. The first thing people ask, why did it take so long for Gacy to be arrested? Okay, and I can only explain it that thank God for Des Plaines Police Department, because Chicago, with its huge population, comparing it to Des Plaines, we we just couldn't handle it. Everybody was getting 10, 20, 30 missings a day in Chicago, and it was a rare thing for Des Plaines.
Right,
But thank God for Kozensack and company, he taking it seriously and stepping up and getting on it with his people right away. I mean,
right.
if it wasn't for them, how much longer would Gacy have gone?
It's
You
hard
know,
to say. It's hard to
in
say.
Chicago, yeah,
And you have to also give credit. I frankly give more credit to Mrs. Peast than I
oh
do
yes,
to Kozenczak because Mrs. Peast was the first victim's parent. And granted, you're right, because she was able to go to the Des Plaines Police Department as opposed to trying to walk into, a Chicago like District 5 or wherever it would have been, and getting to the desk sergeant or whoever was up there up front and getting no play probably.
right.
She was able to get in people's faces immediately that night that
It
her
meant a
son went
lot.
missing. It meant everything.
Yeah,
And they could tell that she was not a woman to be ignored or messed with. She was dead serious. She's like, "Don't tell me that my son ran away. I can
right.
assure you my son did not run
Right.
away.
And the
Something nefarious has
circumstances were
happened."
different. It was her birthday.
Exactly.
I mean, she was
Exactly.
expecting pick them up, take them home. They're going to have cake, a celebration,
Exactly.
family.
Exactly.
And he just doesn't appear. He's gone.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, you're right. The Chicago at the time, no computers. The police department's broken up at that time in 5 different areas with 24 police districts. Okay. And so those reports, when they get filed, weren't getting filed immediately. I mean, they weren't getting assigned immediately for follow up. They were going through police mail. where the officer took the report on the street, returned to his office, dumped the report off. It would sit there until the police mail car came and picked up the report. And that was once a day. And it would be taken downtown to headquarters, and then they'd check it and send it to the area. And that alone's taking 2 days. And then the area is going to assign it to a youth officer who may or may not be working for a couple of days. So it's going to be 3-4 days before that even gets to an actual investigator for follow-up. And time is everything with a missing. You want to reach out and find out who was with them last and check the boxes. But
For sure.
it wasn't being done because there was no communication either between the districts and the areas.
Right.
Thank God that they did what they did there. I mean, Kozenczak, he had a very strong connection to it. First, he had a son that went to school where the Peace Boy did.
And Bill, let me just tell the people. So Joe Kozenczak was he was a lieutenant with the Des Plaines Police Department, and he ultimately headed up the investigation into Gacy, which only took 10 days. So I just want to let people know that maybe aren't familiar with some of the characters. That's who Kozenczak is. Go ahead, Bill.
Right.
Sorry.
And so Kozenczak gathered his people together and said, I want you to start following this guy. But right away, they ran a record check on him, which wasn't done in Chicago often. On the prior cases where Gacy got arrested after he'd been back to Chicago and released from prison. But they learned that he had the conviction for sodomy, which again raised more flags, and so they were on him from the beginning. And it was only through their daily 24/7 chase for 10 days. But, that's where it comes in. It's really, I'm repeating the story, and I'm repeating like what's already known before. But what is of interest to me, and this is what connected me to you, was the tapes that you presented on your podcast.
Right.
Okay. I mean, I had the case file that Kozenczak gave me, and I had suspicions about the evidence, and I was inquisitive of that. But when I found out you were questioning it, I tuned into you real quick, and I said, this guy's right on it. And, you've got the story about how, everybody knows Gacy got arrested after 10 days, but they don't know what could have happened if he had gone to court the following Monday, or I think it was the Monday, and in the federal court got the injunction against the police department to stop searching. And I think you should remind the people what happened with that.
Yeah. Like kind of everything and you're talking about the Chicago police, right?
No, I'm talking about Des Plaines. When Des Plaines, that Gacy went to the attorney and got the attorneys to go to federal court to get.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so yeah, you jumped kind of the end of it. So like ultimately, and people that haven't listened to my podcast, number one, you should. And if you hit that QR code, it'll bring you right to our podcast. And I highly recommend it. The Gacy season is like no other. There's nothing that's been done with Gacy that's even close to it, if I don't say so myself, and I'm not afraid to say that because it's true. But in terms of the most famous piece of evidence in that case was this photo receipt. And that photo receipt was something that ultimately got Des Plaines back into the house for a second search, because they had already been into Gacy's house on December 13th for their initial search. They didn't find anything during that search that related to Rob Peast, meaning that they didn't find anything that would give them the probable cause to be able to step in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, this is what we found in Gacy's house. We believe that he's either done something with Rob Peast in terms of kidnapping and moving him somewhere, or far worse. So they didn't have that. And Bill, explained to the people so that they understand from law enforcement's perspective that once they effectuate that search warrant, they're done. They can't go back in the house, correct? On that search warrant, they have to get a second one, right?
That's right.
And what do
And
you need to do to get a second search warrant?
well, you got to develop other evidence
Exactly.
that leads you back to that house that targets
Exactly.
the person there. But you also got to be more specific in what you're looking for. You know,
Exactly.
I mean, at first, all they're looking for is a body, and being Mr. Peast himself. All right, and not finding him there, they walked away, and they were at a loss.
Right.
So they needed to get back into that house. But it's the story about how that evolved. I mean,
Right.
one of the first conversations you and I had, um, we talked about the first search was, I think, on the 13th of December. Was it? I think it
Yeah.
was the
It
13th.
was my birthday. My birthday,
Okay,
Bill.
happy birthday to you.
Aw,
And
Bill.
yeah, I got a great voice.
You do. You have golden pipes, my friend.
Yeah. Anyway, um, the 13th, Kosensack does a search, and it's no different if you're in Chicago Police or Des Plaines or wherever. There's strict rules about how you gather evidence. All right. And he instructed his men before they even went out there to the house that if you find anything that you believe is evidence, don't touch it until we get the evidence tech there to photograph it, and then we will inventory it.
Right.
Okay. Well, on the 13th, there's no mention that that they found the photo receipt.
Right.
There's no evidence of it.
Nothing. No
Right. It's
photograph.
not in, and I looked through that, and I kept wondering, well, and the first question you asked me, Bill, if you would have found the photo receipt in the trash basket like it was supposedly found, what would you have done next? I said, well, it was from the pharmacy. Boom, in the car, right to the pharmacy. I want to get that book.
Immediately.
I want to verify everything on that.
Exactly.
All right.
You don't have to be Columbo to figure out that
Right.
you
But it's
find
got
a
the name
receipt.
of the place where he works.
Right, where the kid
That
went missing
pharmacy.
from.
Well,
Right.
that's a direct link to your person that you're looking for.
Exactly.
All right. But the story goes on with them is that now they need to get back into that house again. And suddenly, after various communication with Kim Byers, they learn of the receipt. And Kosensack goes, the receipt, my God, runs back to the evidence room, goes in, and there it is. He's got the receipt already in the evidence room. It's never been photographed before. It was never put into evidence, never inventoried.
That's according to his book.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
that's not what really happened. What really happened.
Well, we know.
Yeah.
We know, but that's what the story he used. I mean,
Right.
he had to use it, but how dumb would that be to know that you got the receipt from the pharmacy and on the 13th, you don't relate that as possible evidence in connection to the boy you're looking for.
Right.
And then boom, you find it later.
Well, what makes it even more implausible is if you didn't think that it was important evidence, why would you have collected it to begin with? So, you know what I
So
mean? Like
true.
when you're
So
going
true.
in on a search, Bill, you're not getting a pair of socks that you see under Gacy's bed just because you want a souvenir. You're in there, as you stated, with specificity in terms of what you're looking for. And they
Right.
were obviously looking for all of the all the articles of clothing that Rob Peast was known to have been wearing at the time that he disappeared, as well as anything that could connect Gacy to Rob Peast. And obviously a photo receipt from the very pharmacy where Rob Peast worked and disappeared from would be a smoking gun piece
Oh,
of
God.
evidence if it was found in Gacy's garbage. So
Right.
not only would that have not sat in his little storage area for evidence slash his polygraph room, like he used it as
Yeah.
his polygraph lab and his where he kept all the important evidence. So yeah, like I was able to destroy that with the help of because I had the same feelings that you did when I was reading through the police reports. I'm like, okay, I'm looking at the property evidence log from the search of the 13th. And you and I know this case like the back of our hands. We know what the story's always been. The narrative's always been that the receipts what got him in the house the second time, which is when they went down to the crawl space and started digging up all these poor young men and boys that were killed by Gacy, right? So that's been the narrative for 40 years
Yeah.
until I started my podcast. And
Right.
much like you, I'm reading through And I tell Darren, I'm like, look, man, and this is before we interviewed the first cop, the first old Des Plaines cop. And I said, Darren, man, and as an attorney, I look through these property evidence logs constantly. I'm always
Sure.
looking at chain of custody. For a defense attorney, it's our primary thing. That's how we can figure out whether or not cops are planting things. That's the purpose of property evidence logs and chain of custody, so that we know where it was found by way of a photograph of where it's located. And then once the tech picks it up, he indicates, he gives it a number, and then he says where it's going to get sent. If it's a biological or forensic type thing, we're sending it to the Illinois lab. It's going to the Illinois State lab. So that that wasn't anywhere on the sheet that I had, which was from the Cook County Sheriff's Police. Right. So it was, because remember, Des Plaines is heading the investigation. It's in an area of Chicago, or actually Norwood Park, which is unincorporated, which means that they did not have their own police department, fire department. The bigger communities surrounding them would supply them with law enforcement and, firemen if there was the need for it. So when this search on the 13th happens, they call up Cook County and they say, hey, can you guys send us out an evidence tech? Because Des Plaines is a small department, right? They don't have the kind of financing and manpower and resources that Cook County does. So Cook County calls a guy, one of the evidence techs, a guy named Carl Humbert, who nobody had ever spoken to in 40 years, Bill. I was literally the first person that ever spoke to him. When I called him, I'm like, how many people have called you like over the past 40 years? He's like, you're literally the one and only person that's ever called me. And this was the guy that was keeping track of the evidence that was found in Gacy's house on the 13th. He was the only dude. He would follow the cops around. They're like, I got something here. He'd run into the room and say, what do you got? He'd take his photograph, say, all right. He'd indicate what it was, where it was found, and boom, he'd move on. Kozenzak and Adams are in the kitchen, allegedly. And, Adams is pulling out the length of rope, like a 2-foot length of rope, which, if you know anything about Gacy, the rope trick was his preferred method of killing. So that could have been significant. These guys don't know that at the time. They probably think that was used finding, right? That's how he's into
that rope is of interest too, because according to what I know about it, the rope was inventoried and photographed in the same trash basket where the photo receipt should have been.
Exactly.
So how can one of his investigators find a rope and doesn't find the receipt?
And the wallet insert, the plastic wallet.
There's the wallet insert also.
Right.
And the other thing about it is, if you find that photo receipt with the pharmacy name on it connecting Gacy to Peace, I'm now leaving his house without taking Gacy with me.
Right.
Like, he's coming with me on the 13th.
Right. I got you, dude. You know what I mean? Like, you're done, son. Look what I just, like, this is the direct connection.
And that's allowing us to continue the search of the house and the cars and everything.
Everything. That opens it all up.
Sure does.
If you make that find right then and there, it's game over. You're going to go secure another warrant. Like, if you need to, like, if you run out of time, like, because eventually Humbert went down into the crawl on the 13th too. People don't seem to understand that. And he didn't smell the smell of death, because there wasn't the smell of death anymore. These were all skeletal remains. And he had Peast and Cram dump 900 pounds of lime that, Bill, you believe he stole from the
Corrado Landscaping, right next to the Miami apartments.
Yeah, like, so, like, and if anybody wasn't listening to the pod, like, that was how Gacy operated. Like, not only was he a murdering psychopath, but he also was a horrific thief, just a notorious thief. He would go to his friend's Christmas tree lot, steal Christmas trees while the lot was closed, and then go and sell them on his own. I mean, the guy, he was like the worst in every single way. There was no loyalty among thieves with him, and obviously he was a monster. So fast forward to Kozenzak doesn't get what he needs on the 13th. I end up getting a report that gets shelved. So that property evidence log was never sent to my father, because when I do the first interview with, like, so the thing that I had from Cook County Sheriff's Police is not what was entered into evidence at court. What that
Mhm.
was, in terms of a property evidence log, was something that Kozenzak's wife had prepared for
Yes.
him, where in that, which was the inventory of the search of the 13th, he added in there that they found the photo receipt, good old number 12 on that log. So I
Yes.
had both, and I'm looking at them. So that's when Mike Albrecht tells me, he's like, after a long interview, and I'm like, Mike, like, real engaging guy. I really enjoyed him. I took him out to steak, for steak a couple times afterwards. I really enjoyed, he's a really nice guy. Like all those guys were, like just salt of the earth, all these guys, because they had nothing to do with what ends up happening. These were the guys that were boots on the ground out on the street doing the work. And Kozenzak was doing all the bidding behind the scenes in terms of setting this thing up. The guys that were out, the detectives and the guys that were tasked with following Gacy on that 24/7 tail, they had no idea. And so what was going on the other end of it? They just know that the guys that are following Gacy, that there's some kind of bizarre friendship that kind of develops, whereas they're very friendly with Gacy, but they're both playing a game of cat and mouse. They're trying to elicit information from Gacy, and Gacy in turn is trying to elicit information from them. And they
Right.
both knew it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Gacy's inviting them into the house to eat food with them that they had picked up, so they had been in the house a couple of times, and but they weren't getting anything because Gacy was not an idiot. I mean, the guy is clearly not going to kill anybody while he knows. And remember, this is an open and obvious tale. And that was due to the fact that Desplaines, again, just didn't have the resources to do a true undercover tale of him, because that requires, like, I think Dave Hackmeister said it would have required at least 10 different cars, because when one car
Yeah.
loses another car, they have to have another car set up
Oh,
to say, all
I
right, I
mean, I've
lost it.
done that. I've done that so many times in my career.
Well, tell
You
us
know,
about it. Tell,
well,
what do you have to do to have an undercover,
you need
of that?
multiple cars, because you got to run the perimeters too. You're not all following in a row with him, because he might take a turn and go left, right. So you've got people going on the same direction on other streets.
Right.
You know, and
Exactly.
it's so difficult to keep up with somebody in a very crowded city with traffic as it is. It's very
And
easy.
Gacy drove like an absolute maniac.
Right, he drove like a maniac.
A
Yeah,
ma Like, literally like a maniac. Like, this guy had like, I think it was a 1976 or 77 Olds that he was cruising around in, this big black thing that he
yeah,
outfitted to look like a cop car.
yeah. He had a spotlight.
Yep. And
I don't know if I ever told you this, but um, I had an encounter with Gacy. Not really an encounter. When I was transferred to the 19th district back in about 19, I was there around 77. I think this would have been, and I was going with my partner, driving in our unmarked cars we had every day. And we were on Belmont Avenue approaching Clark Street. And just on the west side of that intersection, facing west, was a car. And as we're approaching, I see Gacy stepping out of the driver's side of the car. And there's two people on the sidewalk right next to the car on the passenger side. And Bob, I mean, I slowed down. I looked. I saw it was Gacy there. He saw me. He waved, and I waved back to him. And that's haunted me. You know why?
yeah,
You know, we've got evidence that Gacy wasn't out there alone picking up kids.
right.
We've got those people that said, I was picked up by Gacy. I ran for my life. He was sitting in the back seat. Somebody else was driving. But Gacy wasn't going to stop two people and try to take control of them and bring them back to his house.
Right, unless he had help.
Right. So that's exactly what I think was going on. But
Right.
I paid no attention really to the two people. That I knew there were just two males, young, and I went on my way. But it still bothers me, because I waved back to John Gacy. And I am thinking all the time now, did I give credibility to John Gacy, who is stopping some innocent victim.
Jeez.
And that wave that I gave back to him is giving credibility to Gacy, who we know played policeman.
Yep. Wow. Yeah, you never did tell me that, Bill.
Yeah. And
That's
that's
kind of a big, and your point's not lost, because like if you guys don't get what Bill's saying, so Gacy's pulled over, and what his MO was, if whether he's in Bughouse Square or wherever he was doing his trolling, in terms of trying to find a victim, he'd get them in. He'd be real gregarious and say, "Hey, how you doing, kid? Come on in. You need a lift. You want to go pick up some food? You want to go back to my place and smoke some weed and drink a little bit?" And a lot of these kids, the kids that weren't employees of his, happened to be wayward souls. A lot of these kids were out on the streets hustling, doing whatever they could to stay alive. And you get an offer like that from a guy that you may kind of think is a little bit creepy, but desperate times call for desperate measures. You end up in that car. And then he always would have one of his little badges like clipped to his belt buckle, like I'm sure you used to wear when you were a detective.
I
And then,
did.
he'd slip his black leather jacket off of it a little bit. They'd see it. And then, they'd say, "Are you a cop?" And he'd say, "Oh, no, I'm not a cop." After he had him in the car. So in this situation where Bill Dorsch, who is a cop, very much a cop, pulls up next to Gacy, and if, say, for instance, he's got a kid in there, and Gacy's like, "Oh," waves over to Bill, and Bill, just being the gentleman that he is, having no idea that this guy's a monster, waves back to him.
Yeah.
That looks like two cops waving to each other,
Exactly.
which then, gives that kid thinking, all right, maybe this guy is legit.
And that was occurring in an area where we know Gacy trolled for his victims, and it was late at night.
Yep.
Wow,
That's a wild story. How could you never have told me that, Bill? So this is a first, y'all.
I believe it's in the book.
Well, I like hearing it directly from you, my friend.
Yeah, I mean, it's always haunted me.
It's a scary proposition, man. It's like you had brushes with that guy that other people just didn't have.
Yeah, we weren't friends. I had dinner at his house. That's another thing. You talk about the two girls, the two Virginias, and their experience. Had they gone to the house, what could happen? Gacy invited me back to his house twice. The first night when we had the party, we had dinner at his house, my wife, my son, and his wife, kids, and him. All right. But before I left, he said, "Hey, you want to come back? You're welcome. We can watch a ball game, have a few beers, And then when he came over to my house to do some repair work with the young teenager, and when they were done, we walked outside, and again, he invited me over,
Yeah.
And I'm not suspecting anything because, serial killers are proficient in fooling people. I mean, they're disarming. And I had no indication, like most of his victims, I'm sure, that this guy was a threat.
That was his terrifying superpower. You know
Yes,
what I
but
mean?
that's-
Like that. That is what made him, to me, the most terrifying apex predator of all time. Like, you had those guys like Dennis Rader and, these guys that operated and, that appeared outwardly to be normal people. They had jobs, they went to work, they were married, and it turns out they were monsters. Gacy was very, very different. I think that those guys were still hiding in plain sight. Gacy was in no way, shape, or form hiding in plain sight. He was out there for the entire world to see. He had friends all over the place. I always say it, when Gacy walked into a bar, the places, the haunts that he always frequented, it was like when Norm would walk in and cheers, Norm, John, he's that guy.
Happy to see him. The bars, everywhere he went, people loved him.
And he was terrifying. And you're right. That was
felt
disarming to people.
He felt very secure that he had protection because he had already initiated the contact with political people.
Right.
All right. And it worked for him in times because he had a couple arrests. Rignall, Donnelly, 2 cases of survivors who were young men, not gay, both had girlfriends. They were on the street, and Gacy pulls up. On one of them, he offered them marijuana, and he wants some marijuana, and they took off and wound up at the house. But in the other one, he played policeman. and
Oh
took them to
yeah,
the house.
for
Yeah,
certain, for certain.
yeah,
And I wanted to
yeah.
ask you, Bill. So, if you know anything about Gacy's history, he picked up the sodomy charge when he was living in Waterloo for pulling the exact same stuff that he pulled with all of his victims here in Chicago. In that, he got the kid to the house, got him liquored up, ultimately ended up taking control of him and sexually assaulting him. This kid's father happened to be a bigwig out there in Iowa
Oh,
and
yeah.
was extremely upset. Gacy ends up getting 10 years, does only a year and a half of that,
Yes, 18
then gets
months.
his parole approved over to Illinois, which is when he moves to the suburbs of Chicago. I wanted to ask you, Bill, back in 70, 71, 72, in terms of you being able to look up background, like if you're in Illinois, is something that he, because again, this is pre-computers, like en masse. You know what I'm saying? Like the
Mhm.
station, it was probably only very wealthy departments that had some form of, early computers. And
No,
I'm talking really early. So how is
it was
Illinois getting information about his conviction for, a very serious felony in Iowa? They weren't, right? They had no way to know it, correct?
right, right.
So,
But
because
but
people
the
always
only way we
wondered.
could the only way we could get the information on the past for Illinois was after we had the person in custody was to pick up the phone and call them to the identification center and ask them to run a record check on them.
And that was only for Illinois, though.
Right,
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 you're not getting any intel
right.
from, because they got, I think they ended up when they finally got on arrest, they ended up when they I think they got a warrant hit on him from the thing in Iowa. They were able to unearth that he had this arrest in Iowa post-arrest, but going into that, because like it's a famous thing that somehow he got security to take that picture with Rosalind Carter, which means that typically the Secret Service would vet the hell out of anybody that's going to come close to the
Oh, for
president
sure.
or his wife. So people are always asking, how did he get clearance? This guy had like a major felony. He had a 10-year sentence. And how did that like slip through the cracks to the point where he's standing next to Rosalind Carter, who at that point was the first lady of the nation, and taking this photograph? So I'm like, oh my God, like, but that's how the guy operated,
Sure did.
like that's what he did. He had a way about him to disarm people with his gregarious nature. He was just that guy, but
Well,
underneath it, he was the root of all evil,
I mean, and the politicians, they all love the guy. I mean, he was giving them. He was. You need, what do you need done at your house? I got a crew. I can get out there. We can do you some work. I'm sure he wasn't charging them. The politician. He was embedding them in his group of friends. And but when they missed, they the police missed several arrests. They had him in custody in the suburbs. Let's see, and he got on. He was on parole until October of 71. Okay,
right,
and um, they didn't check though when he got arrested February 12th of 71. He was arrested with a young boy in Chicago downtown and charged with disorderly. But you're not checking somebody's background on a disorderly arrest normally. Okay. Uh, Later in June of 72, and now this is after McCoy is already killed, he's arrested in Northbrook and he's charged with battery and reckless conduct. But of course, Northbrook, and nobody knows that McCoy is a victim. Nobody's found his body. So, but no, they don't run a background check on him. And if they had, it wouldn't have come back with the Iowa arrest and conviction. So he was able to move out there with impunity. He felt secure in wherever he was going and whatever he was doing. He was a hardworking guy, and he he's born in Chicago. He knows Chicago like the back of his hand. He knew where he wanted to go at night. And late at night, early in the morning, he was traveling Bughouse Square. He was traveling to Clark and Diversey, Belmont and Clark. He was going to the Uptown area. These were the targeted areas where he knew he could find these young people on the street. And he didn't care if they were gay. He just was looking for a young boy victim and to gain control of him. Get him, but he had to get him back to his house because part of Gacy was he was just not into a quick sex and killing. It was an entertainment form for him. It was
Yes.
time, putting the person through sexual assaults and tortures. To him, that was part of his entertainment. That was the program. And that's why killing somebody in the car, that's not for John Gacy. He wants the comfort of his own home, his own setting. And if he got you to go back to that house, or he forced you to go back to that house like he did with Rignall and Donnelly, once they got in there, they didn't have a chance. I mean, what kind of chance would I have had if I had taken him up? He knew I was a policeman when I was at his house for dinner.
Right.
I was a policeman.
Exactly. And Gacy's thing was, if you had a chance, it was because he decided that he was giving you the chance.
Right.
That was
it.
He loved that aspect of playing God. Like, that's how he described it to my father in the tapes.
Right. If I had chosen to go back there after he invited me and I walked in the door and it was just him and me, and I had no idea what he was about, it turns on me very quickly if he pulls out the gun that I know he's got behind the bar. Okay.
Yep.
I'm surprised he's got me standing there. I have a gun, but he's got his gun out on me. And I don't know what's going to happen, just like all the other victims.
Yeah, I mean, like, your safety net there was that your wife and son were there. So, like,
and his wife and kids were there too.
Exactly. So, what you're worrying about is this guy getting you alone.
Yeah,
after the fact, which he tried to do.
Yeah, 2 invites and I didn't go. Thank God. Like I said,
thank God.
We had a good time at his house, but he and I did not bond as friends.
I think he would have loved to have an actual detective badge.
Oh, he would have had an extra badge. It would have been a trophy from no matter what policeman it was,
No question. No question,
Sure.
man. So, all right. So, like, we get to this story and kind of where it started is you were asking, like, about the federal lawsuit. So the first search goes on, nothing happens with it. So Kozenzak, again, the lieutenant that was in charge of the investigation, calls for a 24/7 tail at Gacy. Like, we're following this guy, like, everywhere. When I interviewed Dave Hackmeister, who was one of the 4 cops that was tasked with following him, and they did it in two partner shifts. So 2 partners would sit on him for 12 hours. A guy named Sergeant Lang would then, and they only had 1 car that I believe that they called the Batmobile. It was like some yellow piece of shit. So, like, Lang would go, he'd pick up the guys that had just gotten in for their shift, and he'd get them in the car. He'd bring them over to wherever the guys were, sitting on Gacy, wherever that may be, whether it was in front of Gacy's house, if Gacy was at a restaurant, he'd say, this is where we're at. They call it in. So Lang would come and he'd switch them out. He's like, and then he'd take the 2 guys back. Right. So ultimately, that goes on for 10 days. And as I was saying, Gacy's not an idiot. He's not committing any crimes when he's being tailed. And when I asked Dave Hackmeister about that tail, I said, Dave, how long did it take Gacy to make you guys? He's like, 4 minutes. They knew there was it. So once he made them, there was no point. I mean, obviously, and you can, I'm sure, attest, Bill, law enforcement, if you had your druthers in terms of trying to catch somebody in the act, you obviously would prefer to be out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
You don't want to have an open, obvious tail, because then they're not going to commit any crimes, because most people aren't that stupid. So, but there was still the hope. There was still the hope that Gacy would do something that would give them the tip that they needed. Right. So they did it for 10 days, and the 10 days goes by, and it brings us to December 19th is where it gets hairy for Gacy, but Gacy doesn't know. That's the thing about this. Like, Gacy, all he knows is that these guys are tailing him constantly, and it's grating on him. It's wearing him down, Bill.
Sure.
He's getting irritated, and moreover, he's getting nervous.
He doesn't have control.
He doesn't have control, and he doesn't know if they know something.
Right.
So, like, that's what I'm saying with this game of cat and mouse that he would play. Like, that's when he starts inviting these guys in. He invites Ron Robinson in, and Hackmeister in, and Albrecht in, all into his house to disarm them. Again, his classic move. Come on into my house. I don't have shit to hide. Come on in, fellas.
Yeah.
We'll eat in here. And so on the 19th, Gacy goes to Sam Amoranti, who was my dad's trial partner on it, and another lawyer named Leroy, and his last name escapes me. He was a divorce attorney that worked in Sam's building, and he told Sam, he's like, I want to sue these bastards. I'm tired of them following me, and I want to sue them for $750,000 in damages because they're affecting my business. And if you don't know, Gacy was probably today's money. Gacy was probably making $750,000 a year. He was making over $200,000 a year in early, in the 70s. He had a very successful contracting business. So and he was a well-established citizen. He was the Democratic precinct captain. This guy was a man of the people. Like that. That's what I'm saying. Like there was no one that was scarier than Gacy in my book. So ultimately, Amoranti drafts up this complaint, and it had two elements. It had the lawsuit for the money, which meant nothing, but more importantly is they were asking for a temporary restraining order against the Des Plaines Police Department to stop the tail. That was going to be heard in federal court because it was filed on an emergency basis. So it expedited it. Okay. So he didn't have to wait for weeks. This thing had gone on long enough. So he was due in federal court with his lawyers on that following Monday, which would have been, I think, the 23rd of December.
And they would never have gotten a second search warrant.
They never would have got it. Not only that, the federal court would have killed that tail. They would have said, you followed this guy for 10 days. On his face, he looks like an upstanding citizen. He's got a successful business. He's a community leader. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what you think you're going to find, but you had 10 days to do it and you didn't do it. We're shutting it down. When they shut that tail down, it kills the investigation.
Right.
That is what created a panic between the state's attorney's office, which was, in Rolling Meadows at that point, and Terry Sullivan was the one that was handling that from the prosecutor's office. Terry Sullivan and Kozenzak realized immediately we're in deep shit. Like if this thing happens on Monday, we're done. That's when they went into action. So it's that Friday night on 19th where they had already talked to Kim Byers, who was Rob Peast's coworker and who had claimed the story had always been that she worked the front desk at a and this is the old days back where you'd open the front door of a storefront store and they had the little bell on the thing, bling bling, you open it up and people walk in, and it was a bitter cold winter. She was working up in the front at the register. So every time somebody would come in, this cold Arctic blast would come in. So she had asked Rob, allegedly, to borrow his jacket. So she's wearing his jacket that night. As the story goes, she turns in a roll of film for development. Now, this is back obviously in the 70s, way before iPhones and like the life that we live in now, where we all have our pictures on our phones. It wasn't like that. You had to take your roll of film, you take it to a place that developed film, you'd give them the roll, they'd stick it in an envelope, they'd seal it, they'd tear off the top of it, and they'd give you the receipt that you would bring back 10 days to 2 weeks later and pick up your pictures. That's how it used to be. So that's what she claims happens. And what she claims is that she takes that receipt and sticks it into Rob Peast's jacket pocket unwittingly. So on the 19th, and they had talked to her twice the day after Rob Peast went missing. So they had a telephone conversation with her, and then they sent Ron Adams, who was really Kozenzak's right-hand man. Yeah, like out of all the cops who all said to me that Kozenzak was a lone wolf. And look, man, Adams went to her high school in a room with the vice principal with approval from the parents, and he had a full interview of her. I need everything I had, which you probably have, Bill, too, is I have his handwritten notes from that interview.
Yes.
And she never mentioned in either of those interviews at the time, we're talking about the day after Rob goes missing, when her memory would be as fresh as it could be, never mentions ever putting anything in Rob's pocket, which she would know at that point was significant, because that was a link that if you find this receipt at this guy's house, you've got him. So it's never mentioned. And she talks about other things in Rob's pocket, namely a grape chapstick. Now,
Yeah.
she doesn't delineate which pocket. I don't know. Maybe she saw Rob put chapstick on and put it in his jean pocket. Maybe she was wearing the jacket and it was in his jacket pocket. But she goes so far as to say what she knows, at least one item that was in one of Rob's pockets. But there's no mention of the photo receipt until the 19th. And on that day, Kozenzak in the afternoon had sent once again his right-hand man over to the pharmacy because he had heard from Mrs. Peast, who had hired her own private detective, who had talked to Kim Byers himself, that Kim Byers was claiming that she had turned in film either the day before or that day that it happened. It's unclear. Kozenzak said, Adams, I want you to go over and get the logbook, and I want you to bring it back to the station. We need to verify if she did, in fact, turn in film. They bring the logbook back. They verify that she did, in fact, turn in film because she was going to make a collage for her sister for Christmas. Okay. And at that point, Ron Adams gets back to the station, picks up the phone, calls Kim Byers home. Her mother answers. She says, Kim's at a swim meet and her dad's there. He says, look, I need Kim to come to the station tonight. We need to talk to her about photo receipt number 361119. Okay. Names. And he writes this in his report, which shocked me that he actually wrote that he called, because that was him saying, bring the receipt with you. Okay. Because she would have no idea what receipt number it was. Like that would have meant nothing to her unless she had it. Like, you know what I mean? So he had the logbook, so he knew which receipt number it was. So when he calls the Byers home and says, I'm calling in regards to receipt number 361119. So after the swim meet, Kim Byers and her father go to the police station, and that's when it happens. They have this young woman in a room, and you're in a room full of men, serious men, that are saying, look, we need that receipt that you have. All we need you to do tonight is write a statement that you put it in Rob's jacket, and we'll handle the rest.
Exactly.
And then that's what happened.
You impress upon her how important she is. We know who did this. We know who's responsible, and we got to get this guy. We need your help.
100%. And she's a 17-year-old young woman, and they're saying, look, do you want to get the guy that killed your friend? This is what we need. And then they tell her, all they're going to ask you at trial, because you're going to write this statement, which will be turned over to the defense attorneys, is that you stuck it in Rob's pocket. So when I got her written statement, which I read, I actually had my now 17-year-old daughter play the part of Kim Byers, and I had her read the letter into the podcast, or the statement. And this is not your average statement, where typically when you get a witness statement, you're asking them for everything that they know about what happened, which would have included everything that she saw when Gacy came into the pharmacy first that night. And remember, that night that Rob went missing, she had gone in, or Gacy had come in first and saw Rob Peast. He was exactly Gacy's type. And he's talking to the owner, Phil Torf, who's within earshot of Rob. And he's saying, oh yeah, I'm hiring, I'm hiring for the summer. I'm paying $5 to $7 an hour. Rob, who's saving for a car because he's turning 16, his ears perk up. He doesn't say anything to Gacy at that point. Gacy leaves the pharmacy, but importantly and purposefully, he leaves behind his most valuable asset to him in terms of his business, which is his appointment book, which he referred to as his Bible. So he knows that Phil Torf is going to call him. Gacy's house is 12 minutes away from the pharmacy. He leaves the pharmacy. He goes home. By the time he's walking into his door, Phil Torf is leaving a message on his answering machine, which plays aloud. And he says, hey, John, you left your appointment book over here at the pharmacy. Gacy smiles to himself. Gacy then, instead of turning right around and going back to pick up his appointment book, he decides to wait till about 8:45 before he's going to drive back. He wants to go back right at closing. Gacy has no idea that Rob Peast's mother is driving there to pick him up because it's his birthday. He comes back walks into the pharmacy. Mrs. Peast is also walking in, and he goes to Torf. He says, "Hey, I'm here." And he says, "Oh, good. Here's your book." He says, "Hey, remember, just keep in mind, I'm hiring kids for the summer." Walks back out. Okay. At that point, Rob P sees Gacy walking out. He goes to his mom, who had walked into the pharmacy to wait for him to get off work. He says, "Mom, I got to go talk to this guy, this contractor, about a job. I'll be right back." That's the last time she ever sees her son. That was the probable cause that they used to get the first search warrant, because where else could he have gone? Mrs. Peast is no idiot. As soon as she waits for 2 hours in the pharmacy for her son to return, and then she tells Phil Torf, she's like, "Who the hell was that guy? What's the contractor's name?" He says, "John Gacy." She says, "Okay." She drives immediately to the police station with Gacy's name.
Right.
By the next morning, they have the warrant. They're searching the house. So that leads to the search. They don't find anything related to Rob Peast, including the property or the photo receipt. So you fast forward again back to Friday. They tell her to write this statement. And this statement, like I said, it doesn't have any of that stuff in it, like you would expect from a normal statement from a witness. None of that. None of the story about how she overheard Gacy talking about the jobs in the summer. None of it about Rob saying, "I'll be back. I'll be right back, Mama." And when she heard all of that, none of that was in there. The entire 3-page statement is an explanation of why she put the receipt in Rob's pocket. And instead of saying the obvious thing that I think that 99% of us would say, which is, "I just wasn't thinking. I inadvertently stuck it in the pocket. I forgot that I was wearing Rob's jacket. And I obviously forgot to take it out when I handed it back to him when he needed his jacket back to go follow Gacy outside in the, blistering cold." So that's the way it goes down that night in terms of them getting their hands on the receipt. The following night is when Gacy, and simultaneous to that happening, okay, the two guys who were sitting on Gacy, as I said, at that point, doesn't know how much they know or how much they don't know. He is assuming that they're onto him and that his goose is cooked. So that's when he goes and has the famous meeting with Sam Amoranti. And that's actually on the 20th. Okay. Because he's arrested the following day. So he spends all night. And the way that Amoranti tells the story is that Gacy, out of a coffee cup, drinks about a half a bottle of Jack Daniels and spills his guts and tells Amoranti everything, that I've been killing boys for years. I got a ton of them buried in my crawl space. Like, Sam Amoranti, who at that point had just hung his own shingle, is blown away. And he knew Amoranti because Amoranti had handled some of his, business dealings. Like, he'd write little contracts for him and stuff. It was very, when you're hanging your shingle, you're going to take anything that walks in the door. So he had never done any criminal work for Gacy, but Gacy considered him to be his lawyer. So he goes there that night. Sam's jaw drops, literally. Like, he had to literally pick his jaw up and reconnect it to his mouth. After Gacy leaves, Albrecht and Hackmeister are sitting out there. And the way that the story goes is that Sam turns to Albrecht and Hackmeister and says, "Look, I'm not saying nothing here, but if that guy gets away from you, shoot his tires out." That's the story that they decided to tell everybody. And I've got news for you, that even that statement alone is violating attorney-client privilege. That statement alone tells those cops that Gacy did it. He ratted out his client. So I don't think that that's what he said. I think that he told them everything. I think that he said Gacy's killed and he's got a shit ton of bodies in his crawl space, because the way that it happens on the following morning, the day that he gets arrested, and he originally gets arrested for marijuana possession. They claim that when they're at the gas station on the tail, that they see Gacy hand him what they used to call a lid of weed, a baggie of weed, over to an attendant there. And so they, like, when Gacy pulls out, and both sets of cops were there, both tails were there. So the second set of tails, Robinson, they pull up and they talk to the attendant. They say, "What did Gacy give you?" And the kid's like, "Oh, it's not mine. He just handed it to me. I didn't know what to do." And they're like, "Don't worry about it, kid. We're not looking at you." So they then call Albrecht to say, "Okay, Gacy Gacy just gave this kid a little weed. All right. And so at that point, they then call Kozenzak. Kozenzak then calls Terry Sullivan, the prosecuting attorney. And Kozenzak's like, I think we need to get this guy off the street right now. And at this point, the play is in motion, meaning that they've already got the receipt. So that day, while Gacy's sitting, so they pick Gacy up on the weed charge. And that's that famous picture of Gacy where he's grinning with the Cheshire grin in that mug shot. Because they picked him up on a weed charge, and Gacy's like, yeah, probably like, yeah, they got me on a fucking weed charge. It's a bunch of bullshit. You know, I'm going to beat this. It's nothing. In the meantime, what's happening is they're writing up a second warrant to get into Gacy's house while he's in custody on the 21st. And he's there for hours, so long that at some point in the early evening, he feigns having a heart attack and they bring him to the hospital. All the while, they're writing up the affidavit for the second warrant. And at that point, they're saying that they have two new pieces of evidence. One, a photo receipt that is connected to Nissan Pharmacy that was in Rob Peace's jacket. And they have a statement that was written by the person that left it in Rob's jacket. That's item number one of probable cause. The second piece of probable cause is that they claim that when I think it was Albrecht, it might have been Hackmeister, went into the bathroom at Gacy's house when he invited him in to eat that night, that when the heater kicked on, that the smell of death came out of the register. Now, remember, Carl Humbert was down in that crawl space on the 13th of December, and there was no smell of death. Again, these were all skeletal remains. So both things were out and out lies. Now, the thing that I was getting at with Amoranti telling the cops what was what is that immediately upon going into that house, they went down into the crawl space and started digging. There was no searching that house. They immediately went into the crawl space. And their story was that David Cram, who was Gacy's other henchman, so there was Cram and Rossi, the two young kids that were digging the trenches, admittedly digging the trenches, that had both taken lie detectors, and they didn't ask him the important questions. Did you help Gacy kill? Did you help Gacy groom kids? Did you help him get kids off the street? Did you drive Gacy around when he sat in the back seat and help him snag these kids? Were you involved in the sexual? They didn't ask him any of that stuff during their lie box tests. So at that point, their story is that Cram has a conversation with either Albrecht or Hackmeister, I can't remember, where they claim that Cram, before they're getting the warrant, says that Gacy just told me he told Sam Amoranti all this, that he confessed to all this shit last night. Had that actually taken place, Bill, let me ask you as a former detective, homicide detective, would you have included the fact that Gacy's confidant had also told you that Gacy had admitted to him that he had killed many, many people and they were buried in his crawl space in that affidavit for warrant? Right. And so that's not there. So we know what actually happened is that Sam told them what happened. They are not throwing Sam Amoranti under the bus, who, by the way, became a judge a few years after Gacy is convicted.
Yes. Yes.
And they turn it into David Cram told us, but they don't include it in the warrant. So ultimately, I figured it out. You know, I cracked the case. I call Carl Humbert. I have so I go and talk to the digger in the crawl, and he was the guy who was a Cook County evidence tech who did all the digging. He's the guy who gave me Carl Humbert. And the amazing thing about him, Bill, is that he had all of the original reports that were sent from the Cook County Sheriff's Police to Des Plaines that got shelved, that never made it to the defense. The only thing my dad ever saw, because when I first discovered this like mind-blowing story, I'm like, I've just changed the narrative of the Gacy case. And, you know, I'm like, look, here's the deal. Like, how I'm telling Darren, I'm like, how do we deal with it? Because are people going to be like, who gives a shit? Gacy was a monster. Like, it's okay that the cops violated the law and planted the evidence to get him. They didn't know that he was a monster at the time when they did it. They were just trying to solve. And the answer to that question is unequivocally no. As horrible as Gacy is, we cannot pick and choose in this country who the Constitution applies to. It applies to all of us. We cannot decide at some point, okay, we know this guy's an absolute monster. It's okay for us to violate the law, to violate the Constitution in order to get him. We can't do it. It creates an incredibly slippery slope. So Yeah, it was, it's fascinating, man, but enough about my story. I could think you wanted to talk about, and we're an hour in. Why don't you tell us a little bit about one of the victims that we might not know about? I think Russell Nelson was a guy you wanted to talk about a little bit.
Yeah, Russell Nelson is very big in my mind. Um, he's got a connection to a well. How it starts is Russell Nelson is from Wisconsin, but he goes from Wisconsin to the university in Minnesota. And while there, he's known to be a hardworking kid, a good student. He takes up residence with a minister who's doing schooling at the university and teaching about sexuality. And this man later we find out is actually connected to uh, big name pedophile groups
Yep,
like the Corrells and the Normans.
yep,
Okay, not so much Correll, but Norman. And not only that, he takes a part-time job working in a gay establishment. He's a hard worker, but the people there, they all know that Russell's gay. He acquired the nickname of Parker. How he got that, don't know. But they learn through conversation. His friends learn through conversations that he's got a friend who he calls Cowboy. That is Robert Young. Robert Young is, I think it was from North Dakota, but he was in Minnesota and he actually worked for Gacy at a pharmacy job out there. All right. Well, Russell became friends with Robert Young, and Russell even traveled back to Young's home and met his family. And then they returned to Minnesota, and everybody knew that they were going to go take a trip to Chicago. And then from there, they were planning to go further south. But people knew that he was going to go there with Robert Young. They were going to stay at a person's house and they were going to meet with a guy who was a contractor. Although he wasn't named, it was known that they were going to meet with a guy who was a contractor. And we learned that Young previously had been making trips and staying in Chicago, and he picked up jobs and he would. But the thing about him that we learned later is that the police department up in Minnesota had identified Robert Young as a procurer of young men for sex.
yep.
Okay. And so what happens is Russell Nelson and him, they come down to Chicago, intent to stay at the home of a man named Jim Burnett, who is a gay man living in Chicago. And when they got there at his house that first night, they can't find Jim Burnett. So they needed a place to stay. So they went over to a home of two other people. It was Jack Johns, and the other man was, last name was Bailey, and I'm forgetting his first name right now. They lived together, and they were a gay couple also, but a longtime residents in the Uptown area. And they told them that we were supposed to stay at this guy Burnett's house, but he's not there. Can we stay here? So they said, yeah, no problem. We got an extra apartment in our building that they owned. You can stay there. And so they took up residence there while they were in Chicago. And then Jack Johns and his partner Bailey, who I met with several times and interviewed. Now we're talking many, many years after Nelson goes missing. But I met with them and talked with them. I even talked with Burnett, all right, the person they were supposed to stay with. And to jump ahead a little on Burnett, when I did interview Burnett finally at his Lakewood area apartment or condo, I don't know which it was, when I met with him, now this man is what, 60s? And he's got a 19-year-old boy living with him. Okay. And in conversation, he mentioned that, he accidentally ran into, he says, I didn't know that Robert Young was coming to Chicago. He says, but I accidentally ran into him in a gay bar on Clark Street. And that's how I got introduced to Russell Nelson. And we had drinks that night and showed him around in a little bit, but I never saw him again. All right. And through conversation with him, and it's very interesting, I asked him, about his background. Where were you born? I'm a Chicago guy. I'm born and raised in Chicago, been here almost all my life. All right. I took that as fact until years later when I ran a new record check on him, which is always helpful to do. And I found out, you know what? He lied to me. He's not from Chicago. He's from Michigan. He's from the Kalamazoo area. And right away, that lit a candle for me because I found out not only did he born and raised there, then came to Chicago, but now in his later years, he's moved back to the Kalamazoo area where he's always had family. But what's interesting is about it, two of Gacy's victims come from the Kalamazoo area. All right. And their names were Jonathan Prestige and Robert Winch. Okay. One of the boys just was from the family. They had told the police that he was supposed to go to Chicago and stay with somebody that they knew. I don't know for sure, but it could have been Burnett. And then he disappeared. Okay. The other one, I found a brother of, I think it was Prestige, who told me that what happened with him was he and Prestige were in a McDonald's in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And they were having conversation there when suddenly this guy walks up with a younger boy and introduces himself and starts talking to him. And he's telling them that he wants looking for people to work for him. That he's from Chicago. He's got a business there. He's doing construction. He's paying good wages. Would either of you guys or both of you like to join me, come back with me to Chicago, and you can work for me and don't worry about the housing. We can take care of all that. All right. Well, it turns out both of these two boys, well, only the one boy left, but the witness that I talked to, all right, or the brother of the victim tells me that the witness told him, the guy that your brother left with, that was John Gacy. I recognize his picture after the arrest. All right. So that's connecting possibly one or two boys from Michigan to Chicago and Gacy. But getting back to Burnett and the two Jack Johns and his Bailey, they had a whole different story than Burnett about the activities that were going on while they were there. All right. But it was Robert Young who came home one night after they'd been out in the bars and telling them, listen, I don't know, something must have happened to Young. Something must have happened to Russell Nelson because I was supposed to meet him and he didn't show up and he was panicked already. And it was only a couple hours, after they left each other. All right. And they went and reported him missing the next day to the Chicago police. And then later he called Russell Nelson's mother and told him about him being missing and that he had reported him missing in Chicago. But Robert Young was subpoenaed to testify at Gacy's trial, but never testified. He came back to Chicago to testify, but for some reason he never did testify. And this guy should have really been looked at. And Burnett should have been looked at because not only that, when I talked to Burnett, he mentioned to me that after Gacy was arrested, he ran into Young again. But this time he ran into him like within 10 days of Gacy's arrest in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, at a nightclub there. And it was an accidental meeting again. Okay. And I found that very questionable. And then I asked him, well, why were you in Florida? He says, well, I was down there looking to buy a home. And I said, oh, did you buy a home? Yeah, I did. I says, well, do you remember where it was? He says, it was in Fort Lauderdale. He says, I don't remember the exact address, but it was like on 13th Street. And it clicked with me later after I left him. That address is familiar to me. All right. And it just happens that there's a connection to that house as being one of the places that John Norman was using for people to meet for sex. And so, I mean, I'm sorry, Bob. I'm a little bit, not, tired, and I'm
Bill,
sort
you
of.
don't need to apologize for anything, brother. You're doing
But I
great,
mean,
man.
there's a lot more to him. But I mean, there's so much more to go into. Russell Nelson is big. Rignall and Donnelly are big. People don't know about Jose Chavez either, and what happened to him. People don't know about Rossi's background. This isn't a kid that just was with Gacy and a suspected accomplice. I mean, he did federal time. He was connected to the mafia. It wasn't only like 2 years after Gacy was convicted that he got stopped in the airport at O'Hare, and he was in possession as a young man with $37,000. And they tried to they arrested him under suspicion, and through his connections, he got the money back. Okay, but Chavez he would tell the story about what Rossi told him about how he killed other kids.
Yeah. I mean,
His
Rossi was
stories.
connected because his grandfather was
Oh yeah,
Vito Marzullo. I mean,
but when
his
after Vito
grandfather
died,
was connected, like in a outfit way, and he was connected because he was Old Man Daly's right-hand man. Like
yeah.
the dude who
So
was second in command in the old Democratic machine,
and
which
I got a connection to a very big place in Chicago to the Vito Marzullo family. It's the Salerno Funeral Home on Harlem Avenue, and we'll get into that later.
yeah, for sure.
But
All right, dude, listen. It's 3.
I'm sorry, but I'm running out of steam, Bob.
I could tell, my friend, and you know what? You don't need to apologize for jack shit. You've earned that in your life, and it's 3:12 AM for you. So,
Yeah.
playing through, it's a young man's game, like not everybody can play through. I love you, man. Like we'll hit Russell Nelson. And remember, I got no problem starting these lives earlier so that you're not having to be up in the wee hours, and so you're feeling more
You're a busy man. I mean, I follow you, man, and you are
Yeah.
so busy. I don't know. There's no dust under your feet. I'll tell you that.
No, that's for sure. That is for sure. I'm over, like some would say, I'm too busy that I need to focus on one thing, and there's probably some truth in that, but I've got limited time too, so I gotta make things happen. So I'm trying to work my tail off to make all things happen. And I adore you. I'm so excited. You and I have a pretty big meeting tomorrow morning, which I want you to get some rest for.
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do. And it's very much related to this. And I want you to go get some shut eye so you're sharp, because we're gonna have to do some yapping tomorrow, my friend, in the morning.
Yes, sir. I'll have plenty of coffee. I'll be ready for it. I assure you.
All right.
Okay. You
All
too.
right,
Thank you,
Bill.
Bob.
All right. Always.
Good night, all.
All right. All right. So there's Bill. I love him. He's such a show. I mean, the man's a hero. Like if I were to tell you the background of Bill, and just the amazing things that he's done, like Bill Dorsch is what we want every cop to be. And that's facts. Like the stories that Bill has and the things that Bill has done, and Bill is without question the greatest law enforcement victims advocate that I've ever met. The man lives to advocate for victims. I mean, he truly does. Like I'm not overstating that at all. So thank you guys. We're going to cut it here at 1:15. This is not going to be one of my legendary 3-hour Delphi rants. So for many of you, I'm sure that's welcome news. And as always, I adore each and every one of you. I thank you for all the family hugs that you gifted out tonight. Meg P, J Bird, welcome to the fam. Aw, family hug. Jolene, always. You basically got it's your favorite time. It's my favorite time, Jolene, when I kind of gave you the rundown of the receipt. So I basically, if you haven't listened to my Gacy podcast, it's not about Gacy. It's about the victim. It's about that investigation. It's about what we uncover during the making of that podcast, which was this unbelievable story about how they got Gacy and the trial. You know, it's a very different thing. It's 36 episodes. It ends with the lead prosecutor was kind enough to read his entire closing argument, which was 3 hours. And the only people on the planet that ever heard that were the people in the courtroom. The closing argument that was used to put down one of the most awful human beings to ever walk the planet. The pod's like nothing else you ever hear. So even if Gacy like gives you the willies, this ain't that, and it's worth your time. I would put it up there with any podcast that's been made, including Serial. I really would. And it's 36 episodes. It's epic. It's different. It's different, and it's scripted. It's not me, kind of just riffing. It's me basically reading you my book that I wrote that happens to include the Gacy tapes that my father gave me with him interviewing Gacy, and additionally all the cops that were all the interviews. I interviewed so many people in that, and we intertwined it within the story itself. I'm very proud of it. I'll just put it that way. So again, thank you guys. Oh, Jolene with another $10 holla. So Jolene with $30 a holla. Bill, the work you are doing is so invaluable, and he's still backstage so he can see this. Thank you so much for your dedication to justice, for victims and their families. Your passion is amazing. I could not agree more. Bill is a gift to all of us. And so we do have a big meeting tomorrow. And I want more than even for myself, I want to make it happen for Bill because he deserves it. He's worked his ass off, not only as a cop for a long, long time, but for the last 20 years trying to advocate for people that no one has advocated for. No one. The law enforcement agencies that should have been doing the job didn't do it. So one lone man did it on his own. And he deserves to have his story told where the whole damn world can hear it. And I have every intention on pitching the hell of that thing tomorrow so that we can get something done to get his story and my story out as well. So thank you guys for being here. I adore all of you. If you haven't, make sure you sub to the station or the channel. You got tons of content, cover all kinds of stuff. I always have Bill on. We're going through our podcast that we're doing together because these all get turned into podcast episodes when Bill and I are done with doing these. These are going to turn into our Audible podcast. They'll be edited. They'll be cleaned up. They'll be what you usually expect from our DD podcast. But in terms of our YouTube channel, we have tons of content. I cover all kinds of stuff. I'm knee deep in Delphi like probably no one else is. And I actually have kind of an idea what I'm talking about when it comes to the law. So, and I try to make it so that you guys can walk out of my lives just a little more educated about the law. So when you get in those barroom arguments about the law, you're going to win them because I told you so. So thank you guys for being here. Make sure you're sharing, make sure you're subbing, make sure you're liking, please. That all helps us in the algorithm. And I think last I checked, and I don't know if Mandy has checked, I was, I think, like 36 away from breaking 15,000 subs, which is pretty good because I just started this channel in earnest in October, late October. So I thank everybody who subs to the channel. I really do. You guys mean everything because without you, I'd just be an old man talking about old and new cases. Talk at you next time.